Hello and welcome to Theta Sigma's Doctor Who podcast number 41. This week I'll be reviewing the 50th anniversary special, The Day of the Doctor. Now I should warn you that there will be spoilers in this review, so if you've not yet seen the episode, please switch off now and go and see it before you listen any further. Seen it now? Excellent, then we'll crack on. I did ask several times this week on the Facebook page for your opinions of the show, and up to the time of scripting this podcast only 2 people have responded. Which means either the rest of you haven't seen it yet, or you simply can't be bothered to respond. Ooh, can I be like that about the response? Well, yes I can. My podcast, my page, my rules. I know that sounds a bit harsh, but to be honest, knowing how many people did see those posts, and I know it was well over 100, I've got to admit to being disappointed in the responses that I got. And that's actually made me wonder whether I'm even getting the listeners to make the time and effort of producing the podcast week by week worthwhile. Let me know what you think, and I'll be thinking about the future of the show at the same time. But what about those who did respond? First up was Michael Doyle, who said it was everything I'd hoped for. Great banter between the Doctors, incredible special effects, and a look into events that lead up to the new series. Plus it had so many great little bonuses, such as references to old episodes, running jokes that began years ago, and the cameo to end all cameos. And most importantly, it redeemed the Doctor. He's no longer the man who committed genocide twice over. I cannot stop watching it. I keep picking up new things. Thanks for that, Michael. And as someone who's halfway through my 5th watch of the episode, I know what you mean about finding new things every time. Next to comment was Jeff Wardell, who observed thus. On first view I didn't like it. It was short of plot with too many loose ends. But after seeing the almost universal praise of it, I couldn't figure out why I didn't like it, so I forced myself to watch it again. This time I liked it more. While it wasn't great, it was good. I loved the obvious bits, Tom Baker and Peter Capaldi, but could have done without Elizabeth or the Zygons. Interesting observations, Jeff. Like yourself, I loved seeing the 4th Doctor back in situ, and to see Peter Capaldi was awesome. But I'm not sure I can agree with your thoughts about the Zygons. Their plot led to a very useful parallel for the people who were unaware of the Doctor's story arc up to this point, and it was a brilliant realisation of one of the best enemies of the Doctor never to have returned after a one-off appearance. And now for my own thoughts on the show. Now, it would have been easy to fall into the trap of just regurgitating the story, and I didn't want to do that. So instead I'm going to look at what have become known as the squee moments throughout the episode. As the show's 50th anniversary special, the episode contains loads of references to previous episodes and eras, and I loved each and every one of them. It opens with that title sequence and theme music used in the series debut in 1963, and in a nod to the very first story, An Unearthly Child, a policeman is shown walking past a sign for the I.M. Foreman-owned scrapyard in which the TARDIS was very first seen. The first few seconds are in black and white before fading into colour as the camera pans round to reveal Coal Hill School, where the Doctor's granddaughter Susan Foreman went when they were on Earth in 1963. As if all these continuity references weren't enough, according to the school sign, the chairman of the school governors is now Ian Chesterton, former first companion to the Doctor, and the headmaster is W. Coburn, a reference to Waris Hussein and Anthony Coburn, who respectively directed and wrote An Unearthly Child. We then see Clara riding out of the school on the Doctor's anti-gravity motorcycle at 5:16 p.m, the time An Unearthly Child originally aired on BBC One television. Now, while I appreciate the nod to the start time of the broadcast of the very first episode of Doctor Who, I was more than a little surprised to see Clara dismiss a class and within minutes be on a bike out of there. Seriously? A class in school until 5 o'clock? Now I know we could talk about detentions and after-school clubs, but that reference was never given. Later in the story we see the same date and time reflected in the activation code of Jack's vortex manipulator, when in the Tower of London dungeon Matt Smith inscribes the numbers 1716231163 to indicate 1716 on the 23rd of November 1963, in another recognition of that first ever broadcast of An Unearthly Child. When the TARDIS is picked up by UNIT, the call sign used by the helicopter to refer to UNIT is Greyhound Leader, which of course was that of the Brigadier, whose daughter Kate is now in his role as commander of UNIT. Also, an image of the Brigadier is seen alongside images of various companions of the Doctor on a large notice board in the Black Archive. Now, while that was a shortcut to fitting in as much continuity as possible, it was still brilliant to see it and try and spot as many companions as possible in that time. Kate Lethbridge Stewart's assistant, Osgood, is also a name from that era. Unit Technician Osgood appeared in the Third Doctor story The Demons, and her scarf is very similar to that worn by the Fourth Doctor. Even the 11th Doctor remarks that it's a nice scarf. Osgood also uses it to trip up her Zygon duplicate, who was standing on it, in a nod to the Fourth Doctor's actions against an attacker in his first story, Robot. Kate Stewart also twice mentions her subordinate Malcolm, a reference to unit scientist Malcolm Taylor, who was played by Lee Evans in The Planet of the Dead. The unit dating controversy is referenced and very cleverly avoided in a brilliantly written line for Kate Stewart, when she mentions asking for the chroma file that the events occurred in the 70s or the 80s depending on the dating protocol used. At that point I turned to the guy sat next to me in the theatre and said, "Yep, way to avoid the unit dating controversy." The Tennant era is also heavily referenced, elaborating on his marriage to Queen Elizabeth I, which was originally mentioned in his final story The End of Time, and first referred to in the Shakespeare Code. It's implied that he deserted her shortly after the wedding as part of his attempt to flee his impending death, hence her fury at him when she finds him in the Globe Theatre. At that time, of course, he had no idea why she was so angry, since the events of the Shakespeare Code occur much earlier than those of the Day of the Doctor. Tennant's speech to a rabbit that he thinks is a Zygon is also partially taken from the Christmas special The Voyage of the Damned, and it's his doctor that mentioned the fall of Arcadia in Doomsday. When Matt Smith tells Clara that the situation is timey-wimey stuff, and the War Doctor ridicules him for it, it's Tennant that remarks, "I have no idea where he picks that stuff up," while knowing full well, of course, that he originally used the phrase in the story Blink. At the end of the episode, when he leaves after learning of Trenzalore, Tennant's doctor remarks, "I don't want to go." Matt Smith then turns to Clara and tells her that he always says that after his TARDIS leaves. The Moment device was originally mentioned in The End of Time, but hadn't been explored in depth. Here the previously explained sentient Doomsday device's conscience takes the form of the Bad Wolf, which was Moffat's excuse to bring back Billie Piper, but not as Rose Tyler. Now that's been generally well received by the fans, but I'll openly admit to being disappointed that David Tennant's Doctor was companionless during this story. I think they missed a trick there myself. This is an anniversary celebration after all, and while the plot's important, in my mind it's secondary to the celebrations, and here was an excellent opportunity to get in another two companions from the show's recent history. There were also several references to previous multi-Doctor stories. Matt Smith's dismissal of the David Tennant and the War Doctor as Sandshoes and Grandad, to mock their respective trainers and age, echoed the First Doctor's description of his two successors in the Three Doctors as a dandy and a clown. Likewise, the Time Lord later says, "All 12 of them, I didn't know when I was well off," which recalls the Brigadier's line from the Three Doctors, "3 of them, eh? I didn't know when I was well off." More of the Brigadier's dialogue is referred to when Kate asks for an incident report codenamed Chroma. That's also a reference to the Three Doctors, when, upon being transported to another universe, the Brigadier initially believes himself to be near the coastal Norfolk town of Chroma. A line from the First Doctor, this time from the 20th anniversary special The Five Doctors, is also referenced near the end of the story, as Tennant tells Smith, "It's good to know my future is in safe hands." One of my favourite moments in the story was when all three Doctors were in the TARDIS, and the console, in trying to compensate for the presence of three Doctors who utilised different console rooms, briefly changes to the War Doctor's console room, before settling on the newer TARDIS desktop used by Matt Smith. When this happens, David Tennant says, "Oh, you've redecorated. I don't like it." A line, of course, originally used by the Second Doctor in the Three Doctors, and later used by the Second and 11th Doctors respectively in the Five Doctors and Closing Time. Of course, there were plenty of other script references to both the recent and classic history of the programme. The 11th Doctor's fixation with fezzes, of course, begins in The Big Bang, and reappears in A Christmas Carol, The Impossible Astronaut, and The Bells of St. John. When the Tennant and Smith Doctors aim their sonic screwdrivers at troops in 1560, the War Doctor says, "What are you going to do, assemble a cabinet at them?" A line previously used by River Song, when the Matt Smith Doctor points his screwdriver at the Silence in a fight scene from Day of the Moon. The white roundels in the wall of the War Doctor's TARDIS were featured in the classic series TARDIS console rooms before being removed for the more elaborate TARDIS console used by the 7th and 8th Doctors in the TV movie. Seeing the white roundels, both Tennant and Smith are pleased, but uncertain as to what they're for. Interestingly, they also later appear in the gallery, while the Doctor and the Curator are chatting, leading to some fan speculation that the gallery is actually the 4th Doctor's TARDIS. Now, I'm sure that there's things I've missed out as I've looked back over this amazing episode. Suffice to say that this long-term fan loved all the references and continuity shown throughout the Day of the Doctor. But it's with that word continuity that I want to finish. You'll have noticed, I'm sure, that I've not referenced the Doctors featured in this story by their numbers throughout the podcast. And that's because there is now some controversy over how the numbering works. Up to Doctor number 8 we have no problems, but from there on there really is some controversy. Many are still saying that John Hurt's War Doctor doesn't count, and thus the numbering remains the same. Others are now saying that if you include Tennant's Meta-Crisis Doctor, Matt Smith becomes number 13, and thus the last incarnation of the Doctor according to Gallifreyan lore. Well, we know that the show won't be stopping, as Peter Capaldi has already been cast, and arguably shot his very first scene for this story. At which point the theatre I must admit that I was watching in completely erupted. The BBC and Moffat are still referring to Tennant as 10, Smith as 11 and Capaldi as 12, so with all these theories, what's really going on? Well, I'm guessing we won't know the truth until the series returns in late 2014, but for what it's worth, here's my thoughts on the Doctor's numbering controversy. In Night of the Doctor, we see Paul McGann regenerating into John Hurt, and at the end of Day of the Doctor, all the evidence suggests that Hurt regenerates into Christopher Eccleston, which of course gives Big Finish, should they ever get the licence, a lovely gap in time for some brilliant Eccleston Big Finish audios. Please, please do it. Now, you can't possibly count Tennant's first regeneration as a regeneration, simply because he doesn't regenerate. He goes into the process as 10, and he comes out as 10. The partial regeneration energy is palmed off into the recovered hand in a jar, and 10 remains 10. That being the case, and taking into account that we see 8 regenerate into the War Doctor, and the War Doctor regenerate into Eccleston, he must be counted as a legitimate incarnation. Ergo, McCann is 8, Hurt is 9, Eccleston 10, Tennant now 11, and Smith 12, leaving Peter Capaldi to be the last of the Doctor's current regeneration cycle. Now, the only logical conclusion we can come to from this, and the plot of the Day of the Doctor, coupled with 12's, now remember that's now Matt Smith's, speech for searching for Gallifrey, is that when 13, which is now Peter Capaldi, finds Gallifrey, the Time Lords grant him a new regeneration cycle, which we already know they can offer, given how they persuade the Master to help the Doctor in the 20th anniversary story The Five Doctors. And that, my lord, concludes the case for the defence. And that's all for this week. I hope you've enjoyed our look back at the brilliance that was the Day of the Doctor. And if you do have an opinion that you'd like to share, feel free to inbox me on Theta Sigma's Doctor Who podcast on Facebook, or post it on the page, or you can email me at respectthething@outlook.com. So until next time, when we'll be looking at much-loved Third Doctor companion Jo Grant.
Well, goodbye, my boy. You did quite well. Quite well. It's reassuring to know that my future is in safe hands.
Thank you for listening to Theta Sigma's Doctor Who podcast. Doctor Who and its associated shows are all copyright and property of the BBC, and no infringement is intended.